Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Today we're doing something a little different. Last week I hit 100 subscribers on my channel, which may not sound like a lot to you guys, but to me it was super exciting, and I wanted to make a special video thanking each and every one of you. So I dug through my collection of retro video game magazines, which includes over 150 issues of Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, PC Gamer, and Nintendo Power. So, to commemorate my first 100 subscribers, I thought we'd flip through issue number 100 of Nintendo Power, which features a list of the 100 greatest Nintendo games of all time. Now, this was published all the way back in 1997, so it doesn't include anything after the Nintendo 64, but I still thought it would be a ton of fun to see which games Nintendo Power thought were the very best of all time. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, let's do it. All right, issue number 100 of Nintendo Power, published in September of 1997 and featuring, as promised, the 100 best Nintendo games of all time. Now, I am going to go through this whole magazine with you guys, but I want to start on this list because I feel like that's the most interesting part, and to be honest, it's probably why you guys are here in the first place. So, one thing to go over that I'm not crazy about here is that this list starts at number 1 and counts up to 100. It doesn't really keep you guessing as to what is the best game of all time. They get right into it. And I also want to mention that I am going to read a few of the blurbs here, but I just don't have time to read every single one. I'm just going to call out a few that I am particularly fond of. So we will be reading some of them. Starting with number 1, Super Mario 64. Definitely one of my all-time favorite games. Here's what they say. So many things are done so well in this game, and it's difficult to single out one reason that makes it the very best game of all time. Shigeru Miyamoto, the designer of Mario 64, had always wanted to create a game that he described as being like a magical garden full of surprises, excitement, discoveries, and danger. The immersive nature of Mario 64 is unrivaled, and that's maybe why it was our only unanimous choice in this great debate. So it sounds like that's the only game everybody who made this list agreed on where it should be at number 1. Number 2, Zelda: A Link to the Past for the Super NES. Number 3, Tetris. They chose the Game Boy version of Tetris. Number 4, Mario Kart 64 for the N64, obviously. Number 5, Super Mario Bros. 3 for the NES. Some people feel that this is the pinnacle of the Mario franchise. They felt Super Mario 64 was better. Super Metroid comes in at number 6. Now this is definitely I would put it in my top 5 games of all time. Here's what they say about it. The heart of Metroid games has always been the incomparable game control and attacks. We all agree that Super Metroid charted new territory with great moves like the spacewalk, super jumps, and super dash. And every game should have X-ray goggles, period. The graphics remain some of the best ever for 16-bit games. Coming in at number 7 was GoldenEye for the Nintendo 64, the premier multiplayer shooter experience on consoles for the time, hands down. Definitely deserving of being on this list. Number 8, Final Fantasy III. As many of you know, this is actually Final Fantasy VI. It was released as Final Fantasy III here in the United States. Number 9, Final Fantasy II for the Super NES. These both were for the Super NES, by the way. Number 10, Street Fighter II Turbo for the Super NES. Coming in at number 11, The Legend of Zelda, the original Legend of Zelda for the NES. Number 12, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening for the Game Boy. I loved this game. A lot of people aren't a huge fan of this in the Zelda franchise, but I loved Link's Awakening. And if you can get your hands on a Game Boy Color, that's definitely the way to play this game if you want to give it a go. Number 13, Star Fox 64. Still the best Star Fox game ever made, I think, and I think most people would agree. Number 14, Super Mario Bros. For the NES. Coming in at number 15, Wave Race 64. This is interesting to me. When this game came out, no one had ever seen anything like it. Here's what they say. As the top sports/racing game on our list, Wave Race 64 stands far above the maddening crowd. This game is not just about reproducing or simulating a sport, it's also about pushing technology to the limit. so that when you bound over the realistic breakers in Wave Race 64, you better have a barf bag nearby. I don't know if it's that realistic, but it was impressive at the time. Number 16, Super Mario World. I want to read this one as well. Miyamoto again. So far, 10 of the top 16 games have been creations of Nintendo's game wizard, Master Miyamoto. Like Super Mario 64, Super Mario World showcased a new hardware system. It was the first game released for the Super NES and the first smash hit for that system. The richness of the graphics were unrivaled until 10 years later when Donkey Kong Country first appeared. Number 17, Tetris Attack. Number 18, Yoshi's Island. I love Yoshi's Island. The graphic art style in this game was amazing. Easily one of the, if not the best looking game on the Super Nintendo, in my opinion. Number 19, Chrono Trigger. Some would argue that this is the best RPG on the Super Nintendo. They did not agree back then. Number 20, Mega Man. I would put Mega Man 2 above Mega Man. Number 21, Super Mario RPG, which was developed by Squaresoft, and that came as a bit of a surprise back in the day that Nintendo would hand off development for a Mario game to another developer, not unlike they did recently with Mario plus Rabbids for the Switch. But it ended up being a fantastic game. I'd recommend this to anybody, not just RPG fans, especially if you have a Super NES Classic. Number 22, Castlevania for the NES. Number 23, Donkey Kong Country 3 for the Super NES. Number 24, F-Zero for the Super NES. Number 25, Turok Dinosaur Hunter. This was just re-released as a remaster on the Xbox One. So if you want to give Turok a try, it's the original Nintendo 64 version, just up-resed for Xbox One. So if you want to give it a try, definitely download that. Number 26, Super Bomberman 2. Number 27, International Superstar Soccer 64. Super Bomberman 2, by the way, was for the Super NES. This is for the 64, obviously. NBA Jam for the Super NES. Boom Shakalaka will always be what I'll remember from that game. Number 29, Mario Paint for the Super NES. Number 30, Tecmo Bowl for the NES. Number 31, Punch-Out for the NES. This game is interesting because it is so filled with stereotypes that are, quite frankly, pretty racist, and this game would get torn to shreds if it was released nowadays. But it's a lot of fun to play. Definitely check it out if you can. And Super Punch-Out also is another good one. Number 32, Super Mario Kart. Number 33, Donkey Kong Country 2. Number 34, Metroid 2, The Return of Samus. This, as you probably know, was remade as, I think it's still called Return of Samus, but for the 3DS, which ended up turning out to be fantastic. 35, Metroid, the original Metroid for the NES. 36, Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link for the NES. I think that might be a little high for that game. Number 37, Final Fantasy for the NES. Number 38, Pilot Wings 64, one of the two launch games for the Nintendo 64 alongside Super Mario 64. Number 39, Donkey Kong Country, the original Donkey Kong Country for the Super NES. Number 40, SimCity for the Super NES. Number 41, Star Wars Shadows of the Empire for the Nintendo 64. Now, while the first level of this game was the Battle of Hoth that inspired Rogue Squadron, that level holds up. The rest of this game is not good. These third-person levels are really, really rough in this game. Number 42, Secret of Mana. Of course, this was just remade from the ground up for the PlayStation 4 and Vita, but I would still recommend playing it on the Super NES Classic or the Super NES if you can. Number 43, Street Fighter 2 for the Super NES. Number 44, Adventures of Lolo for the NES. Number 45, Dr. Mario. They chose the Game Boy version of this game. I think this came out for the NES and maybe even Super NES. Number 46, Contra 3, Alien Wars. An incredibly difficult game. If you like throwing your controller across the room, give Contra 3 a try. Number 47, Super Mario Bros. 2. 48 is Shadowrun for the Super NES. Number 49 is Ninja Gaiden 2 for the NES. Another incredibly difficult game. All of the Ninja Gaiden games for the NES were impossible, in my opinion. But there are people who You can catch people on YouTube beating those games. Number 50, Tetrasphere. 51, this one cracks me up, Golf for the Game Boy. And I remember this game, and it actually was incredibly fun. Trying to get the best score in golf was a lot of fun back on the Game Boy. Number 52, Contra. I played this recently with a friend, and this game still holds up. It's a lot of fun. It's pretty short, but if you know the Konami code, up, up, down, down, left, right, A, B, select, start, and you do that before the title screen shifts over and freezes, then you'll get your 30 lives, and that makes this game way easier and a lot more fun. Number 53, Mortal Kombat 2 for the Super NES. Number 54, Killer Instinct Gold for the Nintendo 64. Number 55, Bionic Commando for the NES. Number 56, Castlevania 4. I would actually put this game a little higher. I think this is one of the best Castlevania games prior to Symphony of the Night. Number 57, ActRaiser, an incredibly unique game. Actually, that's the first thing they say about it. They say, truly unique games are almost as rare as unicorns, but Enix created the exotic mix of a heroic action and economic simulation. The graphics and sound were like a Wagnerian opera, whatever that is, complete with a shield maiden in a horned helm. Okay. Well, definitely check that out if you have a chance. It is very unique. Number 58, Mega Man X. Number 59, Crystallis for the NES. Mega Man X, by the way, for the Super NES. Same with ActRaiser. Number 60, Earthbound for the Super NES. Finally, this game is a little easier to access now that it's on the Super NES Classic, so that's a great way to check that game out. Number 61, Maniac Mansion for the NES. Number 62, Blast Corps for the N64. Now, this is a game that had such a unique concept. You were essentially... You could play as Tonka trucks and just blast and plow your way through these towns, destroying buildings and toppling towers, making way for a nuclear bomb that was driving through the town. I don't know how you can get a cooler premise than that, but unfortunately, I played this recently and it didn't hold up as well as I remembered, but definitely an interesting game for the N64. Number 63, Blaster Master for the NES. You can play the sequel to that on the follow-up on Switch. Number 64, Star Tropics for the NES. It's like a Zelda-like. If you like Zelda and you like old school games, check out Star Tropics. Number 65, Earthworm Jim 2. Number 66, Final Fantasy Adventure. Number 67, Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey. That was an early N64 title that I remember the graphics being really impressive for the time, but if you go back and look at it now, it's pretty rough. Number 68, Zombies Ate My Neighbors for the Super NES. Here they have a list of the worst games of all time. The only one on here that I played was Friday the 13th for the NES, and yes, it is terrible. Shaq Fu is another one that I remember. Number 69, Double Dragon. I would actually put Double Dragon 2 higher on this list for the NES. A great co-op game if you ever have a chance to play an NES with a friend. Double Dragon and Double Dragon 2 are definitely worth checking out. Number 70, Final Fantasy Legend for the Game Boy. Number 71, Super Mario Land 3 for the Game Boy. Number 72, Killer Instinct for the Super NES. Number 73, Shadowgate for the NES. And I think this was re-released in an adventure pack for the PlayStation 4, along with Deja Vu and another adventure game that I can't remember. But anyway, this is like a first-person dungeon crawling adventure game for the NES. Number 74, RC Pro-Am Racing. This is one of the earlier Rareware games, or Rare games. They made this before, getting into all the N64 classics that they made. Number 75, Super Ghosts and Ghouls for the Super NES. Number 76, Gradius 3 for the Super NES. Gradius, if you're not familiar with it, is a space shooter, kind of similar to R-Type. Number 77, NBA Live 95, rest in peace, NBA Live. That was for the Super NES. Number 78, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. These Ninja Turtles games were some of the best beat-em-ups in the arcades. I don't remember how well the Super Nintendo ones played, but along with Double Dragon, if you like beat-em-ups, definitely check out Turtles in Time. 79, Rescue Rangers. One of the great Capcom platformers for the NES, but I'm surprised I haven't seen DuckTales on this list. I don't know if it made the list, but DuckTales is better than Rescue Rangers, but Rescue Rangers is still a great game. Another Capcom platformer comes in at number 80, The Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse. That was an excellent game if you like platforming. Number 81, Faceball 2000. I have no clue what this game is, but it looks like some first-person shooter on Game Boy, which is crazy. Number 82, Breath of Fire for the Super NES. Number 83, Dragon Warrior 4 for the NES. Number 84, Metal Gear. Now this is interesting. This is for the NES, released in June of 1988. Here's what they say. This classic overhead perspective action adventure never received the coverage it deserved in Power. What were we thinking? It's a true classic with lots of variety, items, and exploration. We won't make the same mistake when its N64 counterpart, Hybrid Heaven, appears in mid-1998. Little did they know that 1998 would also see the return of Metal Gear and Metal Gear Solid, which completely overshadowed Hybrid Heaven, and rightly so. You know, Metal Gear Solid went on to become one of the best video games ever made. Number 85. All right, guys, we're on the home stretch. Illusion of Gaia, that's a role-playing game for the Super NES. Number 86, Blackthorn for the Super NES. Number 87, Goonies 2 for the NES. We may have never gotten a Goonies 2, the movie, but there was a video game. Number 88, Baseball Stars for the NES. Number 89, Battletoads, notoriously known as one of the most difficult and challenging games of the era, the 8-bit era. That's developed by Rare, if I'm not mistaken. Number 90, Demon's Crest. Next on the list is Lufia and the Fortress of Doom. This is an interesting choice. This is an RPG, by the way, but I always felt that the sequel, Rise of the Sinistrals, was the better of the two games, but they chose the original Lufia. Number 92, a strategy RPG that is near impossible to find nowadays, Ogre Battle. If you see this anywhere and you're a collector of games, definitely pick it up. It's going to be pricey, though. Number 93, Gargoyle's Quest for the Game Boy. Number 94, True Golf Classics Pebble Beach for the Super NES. Number 95, Kickle Cubicle. I have no idea what this game is, but it looks like a top-down puzzle game. Number 96, Bust a Move. Number 97, Final Fight. 98, by the way, Bust a Move and Final Fight are for the Super NES. Kickle Cubicle was for the NES. Number 98, Super Tennis for the Super NES. Number 99, Ultima, The Quest of the Avatar for the NES, and the 100th greatest game of all time in 1997, according to Nintendo Power, was Alien 3 for the Super NES. So there you have it, guys. That's their list of the top 100 games. Was there anything that you felt like was a glaring omission, or anything that was ridiculous for them to even include on the list? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to get a debate going. But for now, I want to move along into the end of this magazine, where we have the reviews section. Now, there are only, I think, 4 or 5 reviews, because the pickings were slim when the N64 was out back in the day. Not a lot of games coming out, but one of the best for the entire system came out, and they gave GoldenEye a 9.0. They said, GoldenEye advances the Doom genre by adding a variety of strategic mission requirements. The multiplayer option is incredibly fun and should be considered just as important as the mission mode. The Rumble Pack adds to the excitement, plus it's useful to feel when you've taken a hit. The cheat menu is very cool. So that's what they say about GoldenEye. Star Fox 64 also came out, and they gave that an 8.4. I think that's about right. Maybe a little higher, but Tetrasphere was also reviewed, 7.8. And another Tetris game, Tetris Plus for the Game Boy. This is in 1997, almost 98, and they're still coming out with Game Boy games. That's crazy. All right, so those are the reviews. But lastly, I want to get into the previews in this magazine, because they have a bunch of them, and some of them are really cool, starting with Zelda 64. Now, this is awesome, just to see this preview before it was known that it was called the Ocarina of Time. Some of these screenshots actually look pretty well developed. It looks like the game is pretty far along in some of them, but then you see the Hyrule Field screenshots and the ranch screenshots, and it doesn't look like it's quite as far along, but nonetheless, It's cool to see Zelda 64 back before they even knew what it was going to be called. Next up, they preview Yoshi's Story. This game ended up being such a disappointment. Yoshi's Story, one of my favorite games for the Super Nintendo, or I'm sorry, Yoshi's Island, one of my favorite games for the Super Nintendo, and this game looked so good. These graphics would still hold up today on the Switch, I feel like, but the gameplay, unfortunately, was super shallow, and this game ended up feeling more like a kid's game. Not that a kid's game is bad, but one that wouldn't even appeal to adults. So that was a disappointment. What was not a disappointment was Banjo-Kazooie. They basically out Mario 64'd Mario 64 with this game. I prefer Mario 64 for nostalgic reasons and because I think it's a more important game, but from a technical and a mechanical standpoint, this game is hands down better than Mario 64. There's so much to do. The levels are so beautiful and rich. Probably the best platformer, in my opinion, on the N64, just from a pure gameplay perspective. Here's some more screenshots from that game. And Banjo-Tooie, the sequel, turned out to be fantastic as well. I would definitely play both of them if you can. Major League Baseball, featuring Ken Griffey Jr. Ken Griffey Jr. was the man back in the 90s. Bomberman 64. This one's interesting because this is, as far as I know, you can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I think this is the only Bomberman game to feature a single-player adventure mode. They, I think, saw what Mario 64 did and wanted to kind of get a piece of the 3D platforming pie with Bomberman. But of course, it also had multiplayer. Now, this preview is a total gem. This is for Conker's Quest, and if you don't know, Conker's Bad Fur Day started out as a family-friendly 3D mascot platformer, much like Banjo-Kazooie and Mario, and they called it Conker's Quest. But then Rare realized that this genre is totally getting flooded on the N64 by their own games, no less, so they changed directions, and then Conker's Quest ended up becoming Conker's Bad Fur Day, which, was the M-rated game featuring Conker, who had become a foul-mouthed, just filthy rodent. So interesting story there. Yeah, they were called Rareware. I thought so. So a neat story behind that game, and these, as you can see, these screenshots kind of do look like Banjo-Kazooie, but not. It actually doesn't even look as good. So I'm glad they made that change. Extreme G. This is basically Wipeout for the Nintendo 64, a really fast-paced, futuristic racer. It was fun. I'm not a huge wrestling fan, so I don't have a lot to say about WCW versus NWO, but I do know some people went crazy for these wrestling games. Space Station Silicon Valley, another 3D platformer that was fun. It doesn't hold up as well as Banjo or Mario, but back in the day, this was, if you played those games and you wanted more platforming, this is where you went. San Francisco Rush. Loved these games in the arcade. And then the sequel to this game, if you have an N64 and you see Rush 2, I think it's called Rush the USA, has tracks all over the country rather than just San Francisco, and it's a great, great game. It almost feels more like an adventure than a racing game. I loved Rush 2 for the 64. Mortal Kombat Mythologies, Sub-Zero. This is like an adventure/RPG for the N64. I don't think it ended up being very good. Probably why there was never a sequel for it, but they decided to do something different with Mortal Kombat before they ended up going back to the fighting game that we all know and love. Duke Nukem 64. NFL Quarterback Club. I think this ended up having Brett Favre as their cover athlete, if I remember. This is one of those games where if you go into a used game shop, you'll always see Quarterback Club as a game they have. There must have been tons of this, so many copies sold. Body Harvest. Never played this game, but I know that it was popular when it came out. I think it's more like vehicular combat. Here's what they say. Giant alien bugs, dozens of vehicles, RPG elements. It makes us all want to move to Scotland. No idea why Scotland, but okay. Top Gear Rally. This was like a semi-realistic rally racer. I loved rally racers back in the day, and the N64 seemed to get a bunch of them. And this was one that I have. I played it relatively recently, and it's still, as far as just a pure racing game, it's not bad. Quest 64. So the Nintendo 64 had very few RPGs, which was a huge disappointment because the Super NES, as you saw with the top 100 list, was packed with RPGs. But when everybody saw that Sony was moving over to a CD-ROM disc format that could fit 4 or 5 or 6 times the amount of data that you could fit onto a Nintendo 64 cartridge, all of the RPG developers went over to the PlayStation so they could make these huge sprawling games, which ended up giving us, Final Fantasy and Breath of Fire and Suikoden, all these games that were great. But the N64 had a total drought. Quest 64 was pretty much the only traditional RPG on the system, which was kind of disappointing. Well, it was very disappointing. All right, guys, they get into some GoldenEye stuff, but this video is starting to outstay its welcome. It's getting pretty long, so I'm going to wrap it up there. If you enjoyed watching this video, if this is the type of content you'd love to see, I can't stress this enough, definitely let me know in the comments, because I've got tons of these magazines. I've got more issues of Nintendo Power. I've got a bunch of issues of Electronic Gaming Monthly, PC Gamer. If you'd like to see me flip through those, let me know. I'd be glad to do it. I'd actually love to share these with you. But in the meantime, if you guys enjoyed this video, please drop a like. And if you never want to miss one of my videos, all it takes is clicking that subscribe button. We'll see you in the next video.